And so while my panel is being pulled up on the screen here, I will welcome them. And I will say that this panel is a little different than the other ones we had earlier in that the others were sort of like-minded, like roles. This is sort of that, we weren't able to meet in person. So this is like at the end of the conference where you're packing up your bag or maybe waiting for a drink at the cocktail table and you accidentally bump into someone and you have a great conversation about something you're all very passionate about, but isn't as formal as some of the other things we did. So let me first welcome my panel and I will let them introduce themselves. And when you do introduce yourself, please tell me, obviously your name, what organization you're with, and maybe talk about how your organization has helped bridge the education and workforce gap in your own unique way. And since I'm looking at the panel as a screen, Deborah, you are first.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm Deborah Koss. I'm a senior director at Jobs for the Future and the deputy director for our Center for Apprenticeship and Work-Based Learning. So JFF is a national intermediary that really works across the education to workforce spectrum. So this is our space, and we've tried as much as possible to bridge that gap at sort of each stage. So that means thinking about how we can have more career-oriented education and connections to the workplace, while still in K-12, looking at things like youth apprenticeship or other work-based learning opportunities, and other career alignment, thinking through the connections onto post-secondary and then also post-secondary to the workforce. And a lot of my work has really been at that juncture around work-based learning and apprenticeship, really as that moment, right, where very explicitly education and workforce come together.
And Jennifer, you are next in my little window.
Great. Thank you all for being here today, and thanks for having me. My name is Jennifer Carlson. I'm the executive director and co-founder of Apprenti. Like JFF, a national intermediary, but we are focused on tech occupations across all sectors. As you can imagine, all companies are tech companies, and we are all competing for the same talent. So our role in this is to bridge the talent gap, both shifting culture and getting companies to think very differently about how they identify talent, and looking beyond the pedigree as the sole way of measuring their ability to do the work, and attracting and trying to close the diversity gap for the tech sector concurrently. So our focus is on reskilling people who are underrepresented minorities in our sector, veterans, women, and persons with disabilities, and getting people reskilled from other walks of life to close the talent divide.
Great. And Diana, you would be next to my little list.
Hi, Steve, and hi, everybody else. Good to be here. Glad to see everyone. I am Diana Jarbo, Apprenticeship Project Director at the Kentucky Community and Technical College System. We are a system of 16 community colleges in Kentucky, all independently accredited, functioning as a system. I sit at the system office where we provide technical assistance and support to our colleges across the state. I have come to KCTCS in a brand new facet to incorporate apprenticeship programming on purpose into our programming that we deliver as a workforce solution to employers. So yes, we are marketing this and recruiting students all the time, but we moved apprenticeship into the house of workforce solutions. So into the house of those staff that we have that are employer facing. So when we're meeting with employers and we are doing needs assessments and finding out what are their pain points, we're offering apprenticeship as a workforce solution to employers, and then funneling our students into those programs as appropriate. So that's how we positioned ourselves to make this a true workforce solution for our existing employer partners, and hoping to expand that portfolio based on this programming in and of itself.
And Jared.
Hello, I'm Jared Shank, Senior Director for Military and Apprenticeship Initiatives and Special Projects with the Ohio Department of Higher Education. So in Ohio, we're fortunate. We have about 20,000 apprentices in the state that are registered. With us, I would say we've kind of gone in three sort of phases. So about a decade ago, we started partnering, our institution started partnering with apprenticeship organizations, and it was basically a co-relationship. And our schools wanted to figure out ways to award more college credit. So there was kind of a special process we developed here in the state and utilized with our regional accrediting body, the Higher Learning Commission, to basically get that kind of signed off and blessed to occur. About 5 years ago, we sort of went into what I would call kind of phase 2, which is a little bit of what you just heard in the last presentation, where some of our institutions are now becoming the actual registered sponsor site. They're owning the curriculum, if you will. So some of the work that we had done with HLC was no longer necessary because the community colleges were now kind of owning that curriculum and becoming the sponsored location. So again, that was sort of the second phase. And the third phase we're getting into now is we're doing a lot of work in the state regarding basically awarding college credit for different types of third-party recognized credentials. One of those areas of credentials that we're looking at will be apprenticeship programs. So we're looking at an additional way of awarding credit for those, especially those that might have been taken even outside of Ohio that then transfer into the state as well. On top of that, the only other minor update I would provide is we have proposed legislation right now. It is not in effect, it is still proposed, but it's supported quite well about adding in a pretty significant number of pre-apprenticeship programs into the K-12 system and feeding that directly into the regular apprenticeship pipeline as well. So there's a lot going on. I'll just leave it at that.
Great, thanks, Jared. And I'm reminded by my colleague that I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Steve Villison, and I am a program manager at MIT's Office of Open Learning. So that's who I am. And so next, one of our panels, we spoke with a panel of community college experts earlier, and they said the one word that they would, a few of them actually said the one word that they would impress upon anyone talking about apprenticeships is to listen to all of the stakeholders. And so with that, like, what's the best way to get everyone at the table and talking about how to make these things easier for everybody? And you guys can, I'll just open it up to whoever might want to answer that.
If nobody speaks, I'm always first to jump in. Steve, I welcome everybody having some feedback on this, but our experience is that convening everybody at the table, everybody that has to be there, obviously, as Deborah said, is employers, number one, because apprenticeship is a job. It is not just classroom training. It is a hybrid model of earning and learning. So you're learning in a classroom and then applying it on the job for some mentored period of time. The others at the table are the higher ed or the education piece. And then there's the policy. I mean, Jared brought it up. There's always, policy pieces that are funneling into this, whether that's to support the funding or to help create an easier pathway for people to engage. And then you've got the pipeline, the talent side, and having an intermediary like JFF, like Apprenti, like a state coalition that can convene all of those people in the same room is probably the number one way to do that. It's also the hardest. And the employers have virtually the majority of the control and are generally the least engaged, for lack of a better way of putting it. So the idea that it's difficult is a cultural one, and it's a societal culture as well as an industry culture. So whether you're in high tech, life sciences, financial services, healthcare, any of the non-traditional sectors that are trying to engage in the apprenticeship space, it's a moderately foreign concept to bring apprentices in. And so it's getting companies over the mental and emotional hurdle of having to invest in training people and not just poach them. And what does that look like? And how does that differ from their systems today? And that's not a fast turn. So I think from a fortitude perspective, government has to be prepared to make this a 30-year investment, not a 5-year, if we build it, will they come? And not that that's been done till this point, but that there has been talk of that, like, what's the next iteration? What's the next iteration? If we keep pivoting and pivoting, while it can be somewhat iterative, it'll make it that much harder to adopt. And then the systems and the infrastructure, as JFF, who's been around this for a lot longer than the rest of us, knows, is the disparateness of the system and the number of support players that have to be there, from Veterans Administration to workforce boards to higher ed to others. It isn't that it's difficult, it's that there isn't a standardized way to approach all of them. And the reporting in order to get access to all that supports infrastructure is different org by org, which becomes very tedious for companies to implement.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And just to sort of jump on what you're saying, the fact that you were able to list out all those stakeholders is the first challenge, right? So having that facilitator or intermediary or convener just to sort of set the stage is a really important first step. And I think a lot of what you're saying is fairly evergreen. No matter when we're approaching apprenticeship, all of that is critical. We can also take advantage of the labor market in this moment and some other realities right now, right? Like when employers are having trouble attracting and retaining talent, they're going to be open to solutions that they wouldn't have been open to a few years ago. So I think there's a lot of power in the message of apprenticeship to employers right now to bring to the table. You can't just have an open job posting and wait for a year for that job to get filled, right? Like employers who need to get this work done, even if they're not getting somebody who's their 100% productive from day one candidate, they can have productivity as they're building the skills of their apprentice. And I think this was at the end of the last presentation, that over 90% retention rate among completers of apprenticeships. You build the loyalty when you invest in your workforce. And so in this moment of churn, really impressing upon employers, this is a way that you can demonstrate that you're a good employer and therefore keep your talent. And then when you think about other stakeholders too, right? Usually in an economy like this, you might also see an increase in community college enrollment, but right now we've got a decrease in community college enrollment. So how do you simultaneously get people into jobs and get people into school? This is, pretty much the only structured solution to do that. And so, a way to get community colleges and other post-secondary institutions at the table is to show that if you're working with employers and creating this solution, that's a new path to enrolling some students, and one where they're going to have a strong outcome because they're already tied to the labor market.
Right, Diana, she's talking sort of about your role right there, right? Like you're playing that tug of war between industry and the students. How does Kentucky deal with that, and how are you dealing with the dearth of students not coming back?
Well, we're probably doing much of what everybody else is doing. And the most recent enrollment reports, at least from our colleges, show, the number, we're getting there. We're getting to pre-COVID enrollment amounts, but we're not getting to the individuals who were enrolled before and stopped out and dropped out. So, our strategies, what we have done versus what we need to do, it has to change because, we've successfully managed to bring back up those numbers just about where we can expect really for them to be through all of our measures. But reaching those people who stopped out before, during that pandemic, getting them re-engaged is going to take a whole different strategy. I would like to say, just piggybacking on what Deborah and Jennifer were mentioning about the stakeholders involved in things. I learned, I've been in our community college system 2.5 years and was not at any community college system in any capacity prior to that. And, we have to consider all the external stakeholders, so to speak, those employers and, community partners and that sort of thing. We've established some shared hubs of information to make sure regionally we're tapping into the right people. We know who to even call on to join us when we have an opportunity or we have an employer calling for help. We want everybody at the table so that we don't knock on their door 70 times. But internally, I'd say is where we have learned the most, or I have learned the most, as to be expected, my learning curve in the last 2.5 years. And that is what a key part faculty plays in the building of our programs. I learned, we learn best by when you make a mistake or you learn that you should have done something different after the fact, right? You really learn then. But we've discovered through our programming that in workforce, we move at the speed of business. We're pretty innovative. We can bounce and we're pretty nimble. Faculty and the academic side of the house isn't, by and large. And so we are, that's an area we have really done. We have paid really good attention and made it a priority to involve that faculty from the beginning. Number one, we want them to understand that this is not a competition to traditional college pathways, that these students should be treated as, apprentices are students, and they're going to complete credentials, and they're going to be butts in seats just like everybody else. And so, there's that internal awareness piece, but inclusion in specific projects, our statewide projects, getting our program chairs and faculty members to help not only build the program, but weigh in on the requirements of the programs, and the employers appreciate that the most. And of course, the apprentices benefit greatly.
Yes, and if I can jump onto that, I would also add to the very last question that was asked in the last session. Why does it typically end up that the training happens on the continuing education side of the house and not the credit bearing? It is a lot because of exactly what you're saying. It's that you're working with an accreditation system. Accreditation takes time to pivot. And it's not that the faculty doesn't want to, it's that whole system doesn't work at the same pace that business does. So one of the huge advantages to apprenticeship, I think, as a whole, and exactly right, Diana, it's not about replacing the higher ed system. It's about creating a parallel alternate path for people that maybe have already done it or don't see that as their career path for the future. It's that this system is more nimble and it can move more quickly and track faster with the way industry moves than traditional higher ed. And there are benefits to both and there are disadvantages to both. They're just different.
And Jared, while everyone's beating up on higher ed right now, I'll give you a moment to rebuttal if you'd like.
I would probably beat up on higher ed as well. No, I would, I always use the analogy that apprenticeship is like a speedboat and higher ed's like a battleship. Like it just takes a long time for higher ed to come to bear. Just as an example of that, we've got work going on in the state for a lot of cybersecurity collaborative stuff, and we're looking at cybersecurity and IT and different things like that that are being discussed. And at one of those meetings a couple years ago, somebody said from Ohio State, like one of our big flagship major institutions, how many Ohio State graduates from cybersecurity do you want to hire this year? And the companies there basically said, well, probably zero. We would rather hire apprentices who can do this work. And I think Ohio State was it was a reality check for them to say, oh crap. And the mentality was what most of you have just said. The world of apprenticeships can move super fast. If something changes, something new happens, boom, it's done and over. Whereas higher ed, you've got about 20 committees to go through to get something approved. Even if everybody wants to do it, you gotta not only go through those committees, but then set up the meetings to go through those committees and all of that. And it just takes a lot of time. So, there's good ways that those systems can be married, but then there's also times where they need to kind of stay in conjunction with each other and stay separate because it just works out better that way. So I'll just kind of leave it at that, I guess.
Jennifer, it looked like you were about to say something, but.
Well, I was also going to say that there's an antithetical to the system because WIOA reauthorization just happened this week. I think it may have been yesterday, in fact. And WIOA is a track where the workforce system has funding to put towards training. And the outcome is a little bit antithetical, that it is tied to the unemployment rate. And it is where for certainly diverse populations can get access to training dollars to reskill, but also a lot of the university system will track with the workforce system to try and help offset those costs, particularly in building and construction trades. And the fact that it's tied to unemployment means that the funds that come out from the feds to the states to support those costs, it thinks that if the jobs are full and there isn't enough demand, that it's based on unemployment rates, therefore reduce the funding available, when in reality, the opposite is what we should be looking at. We should be looking right now at how many job vacancies there are that are still not being filled, because in tech, we're at, on a national basis, less than 1% unemployment, and in some markets, negative unemployment, but yet the demand is still through the roof, and we need more people to do it. And part of that reskilling idea is that the funds should be funneling towards getting people to migrate or change industry to fill those gaps. And not just in tech, but in healthcare and in the building trades. I mean, there aren't enough electricians. And so the fact that we don't tie it to job vacancy and we tie it to unemployment is sort of the opposite of where the policy should even be looking at how to address this issue.
Great. I'll move on to my next question, which may or may not blindside you depending on if you checked your email earlier today. But we, over the course of this day, we've heard a lot of buzzwords, including soft skills, red tape, retention, and I'll use butts and seats, as we just heard that come up a minute ago. What do you consider the buzzword around apprenticeships right now, and why would you choose that word? And I'll start with Deborah again.
All right, so I don't know if this is the buzzword that is the most commonly used, but I'll say this is the buzzword that I'd like to be used, and that is enough in the mix that I'm picking it, which is equity. I think we had a big push starting with the Obama administration and through the Trump administration around scale. And so there was this sort of focus on growing apprenticeship, and then a little bit alongside that and sort of following on that, there was a push around diversity. And you could see a little bit of movement on who's participating in registered apprenticeships. But that's a really complicated story. One is that if you actually look at the wage outcomes and like the occupations that people are participating in, there's not actually necessarily more diversity in the parts of the registered apprenticeship system that already used to exist, like construction. You have really slow movement there. And then you have this emergence of shorter term, lower paid apprenticeship programs that are in occupations that already were quite diverse before apprenticeship came along. And so the fact that there are diverse apprentices is really reflecting the industry and the occupation more than it's reflecting a change in the registered apprenticeship system. So now there's an opportunity to really dig into that, right? And to say, let's not just look at the numbers of different demographics in the registered apprenticeship system, but let's actually see how the apprenticeship system is serving the people that are within the system. How is it serving the apprentices? So can we make movement on the wage gap? Can we make movement? There was a question in the last panel about retention, but there's also retention within the apprenticeship program, not just after you complete. Completion rates for apprenticeship aren't particularly high, right? It's higher than a degree. It's lower than a really short-term job training program because it sort of sits in between in terms of intensity, right? So it makes sense that that's a challenge, but what we do see is a lot of racial disparities in completion of apprenticeship programs. So how do we dig into that and really get to equitable outcomes for people by race and by gender in particular, but as well as, by groups like people with disabilities where we really don't even have quality data. How can we really start to change the movement on that? And so that equity is the buzzword that I would use. And then the final thing I'll say, and then I'll let other people answer is, another thing about equity is really recognizing that this isn't just a program design. This is about an apprentice who is a worker in a company. And so what the inclusivity of a workplace looks like is going to matter for the success of apprentices beyond just how a program is designed. So how can an employer, what does an employer need to do to really make an equitable and inclusive workplace that an apprenticeship can then thrive within?
Okay, thanks. And I'll go to Jennifer next.
Yes, and so I agree 100% on equity. And I would add to it reskilling as a word, because for us, our program is 18 and over, but the median age in my program from technology is 31 and a half. These are people who are coming from other walks of life, some unemployed, some underemployed, but many who got liberal arts degrees 10, 12 years ago and have been in service industry jobs and are not at a stage of life where they can go back and start over. And so reskilling them and bringing to bear the fact that they have other skills that can be translatable to the job, and other, call it a maturation factor that they can bring to the role, is very valuable to the employers. And so this is where, from again, a culture standpoint, when we talk about how do you include equity in your business structure, if you're going to improve that, then you have to look at competency over pedigree. That would be the phrase in addition to the word. How do we identify skill sets instead of exclusively stack ranking where people went to school and taking the cream of the crop and then wondering why we can't close the gap?
Great, perfect. And Diana, you're next.
Yes, and I'll add to that. I was trying to think of one word, but in our world of a community college system, our students, they're working students. Nobody is just full-time college students. I say nobody, but our statistics, our enrollment numbers will show you that hardly any of our students just go to school full-time. They are working, they're supporting themselves, and oftentimes families. And so earn and learn is the word that we are using, the phrase that we are using, because our data will also tell us that students stop out and drop out of programs, not because the classes were too hard or it's too expensive, but because other life things call and they have to be able to work. And if they're going to choose, working or going to school when something else comes up, it's going to be work. And so we're trying to really capitalize, and, earn and learn speaks to most everyone. It doesn't, there's really no room for interpretation needed. And I think that really depicts what apprenticeship is, even when someone doesn't know anything at all.
And finally, Jared, please.
Yep, I would say a couple things tied to that. One of the things that's soft, I would say, is more soft skills related that comes up more now, is some of the communications and public speaking. So 10 years ago, I would have said that public speaking was a dying course and was not going to be needed anymore. And most of our programs were thinking about removing it and taking it out, and apprenticeship things as well. But as you all know, and seeing and complaining about the younger generations, many of them are getting to a point where they're kind of staring at their phone all day and not learning how to communicate and do those things. So there's sort of a resurgence of that need for a soft skill. There's also, I would say, something that I don't know if we've coined it in Ohio, but something we've talked about quite a bit here is kind of IT and cyber hygiene that they're saying, like the concept that, when you're a kid, you learn about personal hygiene and things like that. Well, in today's world, we need to know about cyber and IT hygiene, how to be a competent user of any technology source that exists out there, because today's world is not the world even I grew up in not all that long ago. The technology is drastically different, and you can get yourself in trouble or your company or business in trouble very quickly if you don't know what you're doing and being aware of. As far as, another buzzword, I don't know if I would necessarily throw anything else out there other than just apprenticeship itself. It is morphing and changing significantly in Ohio. Some of the recent conversations here for expansion are in things that you would not traditionally think of. So like pharmacy technicians, registered nurses, things like that. A new one that's coming out and has lots of interest is our teaching certifications, for all of those education roles, now being a possibility for apprenticeship positions, because it looks like a really good way to basically be able to pay students who are doing their student teaching essentially. And there's a lot of other benefits too, but things like that are coming up. And I always tell people, especially when I talk to our academic institutions with faculty, that the apprenticeship programs are not the apprenticeship programs of 50 years ago. Everybody thinks, oh, it's just carpenters, it's just construction. Yes, that's very important. Yes, we have agreements with all of those things, but this is growing, at an exponential rate. And for basically any trade, any occupation could really be set up and organized as an apprenticeship program. And I think when they're starting to realize that, that's a good thing. There's positive change that's happening, and there's a lot of good conversation coming out of that. So I'll just leave it with that.
Great. And to piggyback off of your communications thing, we did have a panel of, I won't say young, I'll just say younger participants. And they all represented themselves very well. And you'd be proud to actually, Jennifer, one of them was from Apprenti. So you can be proud of your program. They were a great story. And so my next question, and again, this will go out to everybody, but is there an industry that we should look at in the future, that we should target, that would be important to all stakeholders? Again, like looking at our students, how do we get them into the jobs of the future? What industry is that? And I know, Jared, you mentioned a couple just now, but what are some of the other industries that we are looking for to move the needle in apprenticeships?
So I'll say this. One of my favorite things about working in apprenticeship is all the industries that I know nothing about that I end up learning about. So I was on a call today. There's a community college in Arkansas that leads a turf management registered apprenticeship program, and they've drawn people from all over the country. Whatever the National Golf Association is that's like affiliated with the PGA, they are affiliated with them and really do sort of high-end turf management for golf courses. I've heard from multiple states about how the butcher industry is changing, and so they were developing butcher apprenticeship programs. These are things where you don't hear about them because the numbers in the industry really aren't as big as IT or healthcare or these other sort of growth areas. And so for me, it's not so much about what are the industries that we should target, because you find the relevance to all kinds of industries. For me, it's really making sure that we're truly talking about skilled occupations. And as long as an occupation takes a little while to learn and, can benefit from both the sort of formalized training of the related instruction and the on-the-job learning in a serious and structured way, then apprenticeship is a fit. And so it's really sort of based on local demand. And then also, it's always good to look at the larger labor market trends that you'd look at for any training program. So are people really going to get into family sustaining wages? Are they going to have opportunities? I think opportunities for advancement is even more critical in apprenticeship than it used to be. When you had a 4 to 6 year apprenticeship program where you're getting up to the highest skilled part of an industry within the apprenticeship, you've sort of gone through a lot of your career path. Now that we have these 12 to 18 month registered apprenticeship programs as well, you want to make sure that people have the opportunity to keep advancing. So, really just sort of understanding what are the growth areas in your region. Are those where the wages really pay off for that investment, and will people continue to advance? There's like a huge range of answers that apprenticeship could apply to.
I echo Jennifer's comments in the chat there. Sales, there is a like sales associate something or other occupation but it doesn't touch what is modern sales. And I find that I have found myself in a position, several different instances, trying to make that one work, and it's just not there. And I think we need a couple of, sales is such a spectrum of skills. So I actually echo just what Jennifer has said. Aside from, I think healthcare would be a very obvious. We have some basics, but the advances in healthcare, I think, in healthcare practice doesn't touch what DOL has available in apprenticeship to us.
Great. And to follow up, a lot of the buzzword we heard was retention, right? And that was retention on school, which I think, obviously pertains to Diana and her group. But it's also retention of the industry, right? Because maybe sometimes they'll get a bad apple apprentice and they decide, this program is not worth it. How do we make sure that we're smoothing that over, all of us as stakeholders? How do we make sure that we're weeding out the bad apples and that we're coming up with good programs in good industries and jobs that are going to be functional for years down the line, and that offer growth to the students, but also value to the industry.
I'm going to say in a word, rigor. I think, there's been a lot of talk. This is one of the very few topics workforce development is, particularly around apprenticeship, that is a bipartisan conversation. In this world, that's a very minimal list. And I would say that the rigor in the registered apprenticeship system, as we've had lots of conversation about registered, non-registered, companies doing their own things, value on all sides. I do think that there are some roles that could be done either as a non-registered or as a pure competency based, and it could work in a much shorter period of time. But those are process-oriented jobs like HR, maybe sales, since we were just looking at that one. That when you start getting into more technical roles, whether that's software development, healthcare, nursing, things where either people's lives are at stake or lots of capital is at stake. Those require a lot of rigor on the training side and on the mentorship side with the company. And I don't think there's a way to short track those. And the ability to get people through at a competent level means that if we go into the registered system, we start to build that nationalized ecosystem of continuity that says these are portable across state lines, across industry sectors, something that Europe has already managed to create for itself pretty significantly, that frankly, we're a little behind the times on when we think outside of the traditional trades. And that credential means it's verifiable, it's trackable, and it gives the apprentice exactly what Deborah was talking about, the ability to move forward, not get tracked into an entry-level job and then get stuck there. There's career progression because of the rigor and the level of training. And it's unfortunate that the way the DOL works, it's a uniformity of here's a minimum number of hours required instead of doing that maybe by sector or by occupation and varying that. The minimum of the classroom training is 144 hours. I can tell you that there's nothing we do that's less than 400 hours. For software development, it's over 700 hours because that's what the training requirements take to get the job taught to a skill level that it's consumable and actionable. But those are also people that are having high wage outcomes and career progression without the requirement for the degree, which means that that is the kind of outcomes that apprenticeship is trying to track towards. And if this is going to be a system that we're going to employ on a national footprint, those are the kind of outcomes we need to see in every sector in order for this to be sustainable for the long term and companies to have that high degree of confidence that they're getting people out of the community college system that or any other training vehicle that can actually do the work and move the ball forward for the company. And that requires collective buy-in, which is not as easy to get outside of politics. And so you have this desire to do things individually, company by company, that isn't contributing to that greater good. And I know that's a kind of a catchphrase these days, the greater good. But the reality is, if we want to have an ecosystem that actually does parallel the university track, we need a collective buy-in.
So 100% on that. And it's funny because as you were talking about rigor, I literally was like pressing send on replying to a comment in the chat where I used the word rigor as well. I think that's what the registered apprenticeship system offers, and we really don't want to lose sight of that, right? There are programs that are great programs that are less intensive than a registered apprenticeship program, and more power to them. But I think we sometimes lose sight of the fact that, like, it's not a value judgment on these other programs to say that that's not what a registered apprenticeship is. And so in this effort to kind of gain enthusiasm for registered apprenticeship, we shouldn't give up on the thing that makes it so valuable and that makes it stand apart from other programs. And that really is, in large part, it's rigor. I mean, it is this sort of unique blend of on-the-job learning and related instruction, but you can get that in a good internship, right? And that's not what this is about. So I think it is really important to make sure that we maintain a focus on providing that. Then employers know that when somebody's gone through an apprenticeship program, they have the best candidate, and they have somebody who, you know, really will bring skills with them to wherever they may go in the future. And, you know, an apprentice gets the maximum value as well, because they're going through a program that will get them recognized. And so the benefits really only accrue to everyone if we're sticking with that rigor. And to your point, you know, the floor of what we think of for rigor should be just a floor, right? We shouldn't just aim for hitting, okay, we've hit the minimums and so we're done. You then do have to look beyond that and see what else is needed within an industry or an occupation, and really get employers in these new industries to understand the value of longer term apprenticeships, in addition to something that might be more like what they're used to in the sort of lower end of, you know, 1 year or a year and a half.
Okay, and now we are kind of winding down to the end, and I will throw you a little bit of a curveball. Let's just imagine that we've picked up all our stuff. We're ready to leave. We're all hopping on a plane out of rainy Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we come into the elevator and we see Marty Walsh. If you were to run into Marty Walsh, give him your elevator pitch on what you think the future of apprenticeships might be, and how he can help you most of all in your role in apprenticeships.
Who wants to go first?
Yeah, anyone can go first. I know this is a toughie to think about, but you only got about 1 minute with Marty because it's a pretty short building.
Short, yeah. So Marty, introduction, nice to see you. And you know, if we're talking about apprenticeships, and I see that the Department of Labor is making a lot of investment, but so is the Department of Commerce in expanding registered apprenticeship. I would like to encourage you to look at a couple of policy variances that would help scale adoption in a much more meaningful way across all sectors. So not just tech. And that would be to do one of a couple of different things. One is to link the consumption of H-1B visas to apprenticeship on a like for like basis, such that if somebody is taking 3,000 visas, Microsoft, in software development, we would want to see them take 3,000 apprentices. And while it may need to scale up to that point, if we are taking 85,000 visas in this country annually and 60,000 of them are coming to my sector, that would be the fastest way to get companies to engage in the process of cultivating talent at home and being able to invest in reskilling people domestically.
Yeah, I think that that idea of what can the government do to really push employers is maybe the wrong phrasing, but move employers at scale towards apprenticeship, instead of having this system where we're convincing employers one at a time that apprenticeship is the right path for them, is really how we need to affect change. So I think that's a great example of it. I think, you know, you've seen it in the more traditional construction side at a local level, community workforce agreements and project labor agreements that, you know, really connect apprenticeship to getting public dollars on infrastructure investment is, you know, a long-standing way to do that. That can be connected to other industries. So can we use government procurement policy, federal, state, local levels to really build in apprenticeship provisions to that? You know, and then in other industries, we've been having internal conversations at JFF. I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about them out loud or not, but you know, when you look at some of these, you know, healthcare, long-term care industries, when you look at things like early childhood education, a lot of the wages that people are getting are based on federal policies around reimbursement rates, and that, you know, how much an institution is getting is what translates into people's salaries. So can we link apprenticeship to these other ways to strengthen workers' wages in these industries? And that'll allow more employers to then take on those apprentices. So I think there are ways that we can really think about how apprenticeship connects to these other parts of the labor market, like you're saying, Jennifer, and really sort of, you know, the Department of Labor is going to be central in those conversations across a number of agencies where the government can have that influence.
Diana, do you want to talk about your incentives?
employer incentives, that can of course be done at a state level as well. But with I really think as you guys have known and that you do know, and you've said, the emphasis on apprenticeship is federal. And so, if there is that opportunity and possibility for federal employer incentives, because employers don't know what they don't know. But when you talk money, when they can have money to help, because apprenticeship doesn't cost them money, but it uses their resources, which costs their money and affects their bottom line. And that, you're really not speaking their language. If they're not going to buy in, if they're going to buy in with anything, it definitely will be with that incentive, even for a short-term period of time. And I think, grants are out there. We know that. But oftentimes the grants, they're not employer incentives. They may pay for tuition of apprentices. They may pay for staff to coordinate programmings, but that misses the bar with really, we don't have apprenticeship without employers, and the sustainability of those things really, is just not guaranteed. And often it may be laid out in an attempt when you apply for a grant and are awarded a grant, but over the lifespan of that grant, things change, and even the deliverables and the means at which you're doing the work that you set out to do changes. And so that end goal sometimes shifts, and incentives for the employers are never on the table.
If I had 10 more floors to go with Marty, I would do exactly what Diana just said. I would say we need a sustained federal funding source to match employer investment on the training cost, the RTI, which is really the incremental cost for bringing on an apprentice that isn't easily funded. It doesn't go through the higher ed system if it's not credit bearing, can't get access to student loans, companies will pay for part, but that lack of sustainable funding, because if it's through the grant system, it's there, it's gone, it's there, it's gone, it might not be there next time, means that companies can't forecast and can't lay that investment out long-term and continue to know that the funding will be there, and they're willing to pay for a portion, but they want it to be a public-private partnership. So if I had 10 more floors, I'm 100% with you. Number 2 on that list is sustainable funding sources from the government to match.
Tangle that carrot for the industry. And we've got one last floor for Jared to wind us down.
So I'm obviously in agreement with everybody else. On the funding side of it, I would love to be able to argue for more of the apprenticeship expansion grants. I think those were fantastic for the state. More funding in that realm would be great. Something else, in looking at different avenues of funding, something that's being discussed more in Ohio that's we're going to end up utilizing it for our National Guard Scholarship Program is pay for success models. So I don't know how much or little you know about those, but that is to me, it was a completely foreign concept that I have now learned about, and actually seems pretty interesting, to a great way to potentially get private capital into things to work for the state. And I think there could be apprenticeship avenues that could be pursued via pay for success models. And then I would also encourage, just sort of I don't know what I would call it, kind of a policy awareness type of expansion. So for Ohio, our changes to our National Guard Scholarship Program have been a little bit more recent to allow for use of that scholarship for apprenticeship programs. So in the past, it wasn't. So there's a lot of scholarship programs out there like that, especially military specific ones that don't really allow you to use them for apprenticeship programs. So just something like that, where there's a little bit of advocacy to kind of update things into, modern times, if you will, and whatnot. So there's just a lot of changes like that could be done, that could all be beneficial. Any little hurdle that we can remove for students or the state or funding, whatever, all of those types of things. So that's my thoughts.
Great. And I know we're running out of time with this panel, so I do want to thank you for your time and going a little bit extra. Marty appreciates the conversation in the elevator. I'll make sure he gets this. We'll send him the link. And again, thank you so much for your discussion, your expertise. And Steve Carlson, I want to thank you for the behind the scenes work, and Bill Bonvillian and George Westerman. Thank you. And we can all take a bow and appreciate this very long but very informative day.